Hello everyone, my name's Elliot Chapman-Jones and I'm the Head of Public Affairs for the Wildlife Trust. I've just arrived here in Glasgow in what has been a tremendous day full of events. And today we're going to be diving into our oceans, looking at how you can help the health of our seas. But before that, we're going to speak to Kathryn and look at what's been happening at COP today.
Thanks very much, Elliot. So yes, we've seen another flurry of announcements over the past 24 hours, probably the most significant of which is the analysis that's been coming out from three separate analytical groups, so the IEA, one at the University of Melbourne, and EU officials as well. And they've all been crunching the numbers on these pledges that we've heard coming from COP to see what this adds up to in terms of global temperature rise. And interestingly, all three groups are coming up with a global temperature rise of less than 2 degrees by the end of the century. However, that's very significant, but we need to bear in mind that there's a lot of uncertainty in analysis of that kind, and it would depend on those pledges being implemented in full and for the finance being available to back up those pledges as well, particularly for the developing countries. Again, in the past 24 hours, we've had another announcement on ending investment in unabated fossil fuel use. This one was signed by 25 countries, including the UK, the US and Canada. China and India missing from that announcement again. But looking at the fine detail, it does exclude existing investments in fossil fuels and abated fossil fuel use. So, for example, fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage. So if you're interested, it's worth going and having a look at the detail of the wording on that announcement, which is on the COP26 website. And another thing that we're expecting to hear more about today, which of course is of very great interest to the Wildlife Trusts, is an announcement from the Education Secretary about including more on climate change and planetary health and nature in the national curriculum and in teaching. So we'll keep a close eye on that one and bring you more on that later if we can. And finally, just thinking about this theme of education as well, around the fringes of COP still, we're seeing very heated debate still, a lot of activity from the youth activism movement. We had speeches yesterday by Malala Yousafzai, who was here doing an event for the New York Times, alongside Leah Thomas and Vanessa Nakati as well, who's representing Uganda. And they were talking about climate change impacts, how they're affecting marginalised groups, how they affect women, and actually pushing back, interestingly, on some of the compliments they've been receiving from politicians about the youth, the strength of the youth voice at this COP, and saying they don't want those compliments. They feel like it's just an attempt by politicians to pass the buck, as it were, onto them. So that was quite an interesting reaction to some of that as well. And all of this will lead into a day tomorrow, a day of global climate action, where we'll see hopefully peaceful protests. Both here in Glasgow, there's expected to be quite a sizable march, and smaller events happening around the UK as well. So you may see one of those happening near where you are. So I'll pass back to Elliot.
Our seas are vitally important, both to our health and the health of the planet. They lock up carbon to help stop climate change, and they're also a home to a huge amount of wildlife and nature. In fact, over half our wildlife lives in our seas. So to take a look at the health of our seas, our Head of Marine Conservation has caught up with Dan Laffoley, who is a marine expert looking at climate change and climate adaptation and how we can improve the health of our seas.
Our oceans absorb 20 to 35% of human-made carbon dioxide every year, and we're increasingly hearing the term blue carbon. But what does this actually mean?
So there's a lot of attention on this right now, as you say. And if we think on land, we think of natural solutions around forests that absorb carbon. We think of soils, and we think of all the carbon stored in peatlands. And the coastal and marine environment is really not that different. So blue carbon is the term that's been given to particular ecosystems under the UNFCCC, such as seagrass, mangroves and salt marsh, that through their natural processes lay down vast amounts of carbon into the underlying sediment. And of course, this carbon is carbon that can be re-released into the atmosphere and into circulation if we don't treat these habitats in the right way.
What do we need to do to ensure that we protect and restore our blue carbon? Because it's not just about protecting the status quo, what we've got today, is it? It's about going above and beyond that.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And the good news here is that because of how the climate service is intimately linked to biodiversity, what you do to deal with the climate service and recovering and restoring that towards its full potential in terms of taking organic carbon out of the system and trapping it into sediments and other deposits is also what we need to do to recover and protect biodiversity. So one of the things that we need to do is look at where there is carbon, particularly in marine protected areas, which we've already agreed should be protected. And we've already agreed to do everything we can to keep carbon in natural systems and actually protect these areas.
So thinking now a little bit about the bigger marine ecosystem, we've got marine protected areas. Let's say, for argument's sake, they're there and they're protecting our blue carbon. But how can fishing and wider marine spatial planning, how we use our marine space as a whole, contribute towards protecting and enhancing those stores?
So I think it is about that wider picture. I think the trick is a combination of putting in place as a widespread measure, highly protected marine protected areas, but also then looking at the distribution of the carbon services, the carbon assets that we have, both in terms of natural stocks and inorganic stocks, and then putting them into the planning process so we know where they are, so we don't put activities on top that will damage them, and also taking measures in the fishing industry to avoid trawling in marine protected areas.
So it was really great to hear from Dan there about some of the work that he's been involved with over very many years to look at how we can better protect our oceans. And ocean action really is climate action. So the oceans are an amazingly important store of carbon and a store of heat as well. So we know from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that the oceans have stored up to 93% of the energy, the extra energy from climate change that humans have been emitting into the atmosphere to date. But that's coming at a cost. The oceans are warming, CO2 levels are rising and they're becoming more acidic. And we can see that warming trend even down to 1,000 meters of ocean depth. So there's a lot of evidence sort of stacking up now that the oceans are in trouble, and this is obviously having an impact on marine wildlife as well. And we sort of think about blue carbon, I guess, as the untapped resource of climate action. So we know that, as we say, the oceans can store a lot of carbon. Ocean and marine ecosystems store a lot of carbon, whether that's seagrass or in some cases kelp as well. But the evidence for how much of that carbon storage is actually happening and how that carbon is transferring around the system is not necessarily as well developed as on land. So sometimes blue carbon is sort of the forgotten area, really, of climate change mitigation. And obviously we need to see that changing, and we need to be able to talk about that evidence as well as how we're protecting our oceans. And we're going to show you a little video clip of some of the action that the Wildlife Trusts have been taking on ocean and marine conservation and coastal conservation as well. So it's really fantastic to see some of that action that's being taken across the wildlife trusts. And of course, it's not just about thinking about blue carbon when we think about how we protect our marine environment. So for example, plastic pollution we know is a really big issue for marine wildlife, as well as a general source of pollution from the marine environment. And plastics actually are a huge part of the greenhouse gas emissions problem as well. So emissions from the sort of cradle to grave production of plastics may account for up to 56 gigatons of carbon by 2050. So we really need to be thinking, it's a good example of how we need to be thinking about all of these things in the round and reducing general pollution, general pressures on the marine environment. So that's all we have time for today. The next daily update is going to look at the land rather than the sea. And tomorrow as well, on Saturday, there'll be a day of global action with a lot happening around the city. So we'll bring you a little bit more of an update on that as well.